So yes, the first sub-component of evaluative thinking, and probably the most important, is working with assumptions. So, and this is really, you know, a lot of introductory guides on evaluation will mention assumptions. So this is something that's not unique to evaluative thinking, but we think that evaluative thinking provides you a particularly good lens for identifying and problematizing assumptions. So let's start with this. So in that section on alignment, we mentioned claims. So there are claims all over the place, especially in program planning and evaluation. So here you see a claim: if we teach good nutrition, youth will have a healthy diet. What are some assumptions underlying or hiding within this claim? Go ahead and write in the chat. What Jane always likes to say she wants to get people to come up with at least 10. I think it's 10 or 20, but at least 10 assumptions, just in this short little claim. If we teach good nutrition, youth will have a healthy diet. What are some assumptions that are underlying that claim? Healthy food is accessible. Everyone has access, money to afford, that young people will do what they're taught. Excellent. What else? That nutrition education creates better food choices. Excellent. So the parents and caregivers to provide healthy nutrition, that everyone agrees on what good nutrition is. Yes, that's what I always say at this point. Nutrition research sometimes varies. There's also cultural norms about what's healthy, what's not. Excellent. So you're very good at identifying assumptions. It's a natural tendency, and it's an important part of evaluative thinking. There's even more there probably. So assumptions, they're everywhere. They're everywhere. Are they always bad? No, not necessarily. Hearkening back to Kahneman's System 1 thinking, that thinking fast, we need assumptions to function in society, to get through our lives every day. Usually it's safe to assume things, but assumptions become dangerous or risky if they have big consequences, if they turn out to be not true, and also if they have a high likelihood of not being true. So the picture of the flat tire, if you have a car, you probably don't check your tire pressure every night and every morning. You probably just assume that there will be air in the tire. And usually that assumption holds true. So it's probably safe to not check it every day. But if you have a long trip the next day or an important meeting to get to, you might check that, at least do I have gas in the car, petrol in the car, is there air in the tire? You might check those things. So assumptions are a part of daily life, but they become risky if the implications are that the assumption might not hold true, and if there might be consequences if that assumption doesn't hold true. So now, drawing again from Stephen Brookfield, who I mentioned, as well from Apollo Nwake, who works at EDC in Boston, Massachusetts, who's written some really good books on working with assumptions in development. It's helpful. So we all know what assumptions are, right? You've all done a great job identifying assumptions in that last claim. But it's helpful to have a rule of thumb or a sort of heuristic device to just think about categories of assumptions, because it's a tool to think with as you try to identify them in your program planning and evaluation practice. So there's three major categories of assumption. Well, first of all, there's one way of slicing them is there's explicit and implicit. So that's worth thinking about. There are times when we make assumptions explicit, and in M&E, very often, this is something that's done on autopilot, right? If you're writing an evaluation plan or a proposal and you're creating a log frame, that assumption column, or logic model, as we say, call it in the US here, it's almost like it's almost like a ritual that people just say, okay, you know, as long as there isn't a drought, as long as there isn't political unrest, as long as it's sort of the same tried and true assumptions that are obvious. And sometimes when people stop at that, they're not really going into the depth of thinking about what are the assumptions that really matter. So a lot of assumptions are implicit. It's always better to try to make them explicit, to get them out there. And now this other type of categorization, it's not completely cut and dry, that there's some overlap between the categories, but it's still, the categories are helpful to think of. And those are, first of all, causal assumptions. Now, with this one, we don't necessarily mean causal in the pure methodological sense, like with an RCT. It's more of the everyday vernacular sense that something contributes to something. So if we do this, then this will happen. And these are the fundamental building blocks of a theory of change. If-then relationships, right? So of course they pop up quite a bit in M&E practice. And then there are prescriptive assumptions, which have to do with what we think ought to happen or should happen in a particular situation. And again, they might be very good assumptions. Like you could assume that all projects must have a gender component. That could be true, but it's normative and prescriptive in that sense. Similar to the good nutrition example, there's an assumption both that we know what good nutrition is, as someone said, and there's an assumption that people need that, so they ought to have that. So there's a sense of the need, almost a tacit or latent needs assessment lurking behind every prescriptive assumption. And in just a little while, actually, when we talk about multiple perspectives, I'm going to bring you back to this question of who decides what programs are needed, what societal problems are there, and who constituted that as a problem, to then say, I prescribe that these people need this program. Usually it's a safe bet, right? There are needs assessments that are done. There's relative agreement about the nature of the problem. And so no one really complains that no one would disagree in many cases that the program is meeting a need and that the need is correctly understood. But sometimes that could be questioned. And so that would be a prescriptive assumption to question. And then the third type, which are definitely the hardest to identify and to work with and to change, are paradigmatic or foundational assumptions. And these are really deeply held networks of beliefs that have very much to do with someone's worldview, how they see the world in general. The example I use here is that scientific knowledge is fundamentally better than indigenous knowledge. And that's an assumption that's quite common. And I disagree with that assumption. I don't think it's necessarily true. And also, there's another hidden assumption inside of that assumption, which is that there's a fundamental difference between scientific knowledge and indigenous knowledge. But those are just two categories that we have assigned to different types of knowledge that themselves as categories could be interrogated, could be questioned. Paradigmatic assumptions, so when I teach evaluation to graduate students, I use a textbook by Donna Mertens and Amy Wilson. It's a really good textbook. And she starts out, after some introductory stuff, they start out with talking about paradigmatic assumptions. And they have 4 types of paradigmatic assumptions, which are, I'll write them in the chat and then mention them briefly. It's methodological, epistemological, ontological, and axiological. So each of these are paradigmatic assumptions. I mean, there are sets of paradigmatic assumptions about each of these. So methodological assumptions have to do with assumptions around what is the best way to know about the world. So what we talked about before lunch in terms of credible evidence and the debates around what counts as credible evidence, those are getting at paradigmatic assumptions around methodology. Then epistemological assumptions have to do with what is knowledge. And if you've read cultural anthropology, read other research traditions, you've engaged with different epistemologies, different sets of belief about what is knowledge. And I mentioned earlier technical rationality and how practice ought to be thought of as not just a technical rationalistic situation, but one where practical wisdom is more important. So technical rationality is an epistemological assumption that is rooted in positivism. And positivism, especially logical positivism, is an epistemological belief that was very popular in the mid 1800s and before, and largely completely debunked, but there is still such thing as post-positivism, which is similar. But that basically, positivism believed that knowledge could be a true and perfect mirror of reality. So that if someone takes an IQ test, their score on the IQ test is their intelligence, that it's almost a perfect reflection, a one-to-one relationship between knowledge and the reality. And also positivists are very interested in predicting. So on figuring out the laws of nature, including the laws of society, and of predicting society, predicting what will happen in society. So RCTs are a type of post-positivism, which is sort of an updated version of positivism. But a lot of pragmatic evaluators who use mixed methods tend to be more, well, pragmatism is an epistemology, or constructivism is another epistemology. So again, I know you didn't sign up for a course in introductory philosophy, but these are, again, right at the beginning of the textbook from Mertens and Wilson, these paradigmatic assumptions. Just rounding out the last two, ontological has to do with the nature of reality, which is especially for white male people of European, North American origin like myself, the dominant ontology is a Eurocentric notion of reality. So it's hard sometimes for people like me to try to imagine what other realities might be possible, might be out there. But if we are to truly engage with indigenous methodologies, we have to also try to wrap our heads around the fact that there are indigenous ontologies. And so this could be things like understanding the realness of spiritual and metaphysical, and I mean, even the nature of time. What is time? So Ethiopia has a different calendar than most of the rest of the world. Are they wrong, or is it just ontologically a different notion of time? That's maybe not the great example, but it's at least something to think about. And then axiological is the assumptions around the notion of ethics and what is right. So we've already talked a good deal about that. And it's, I think, important to keep in the forefront of, you know, different people have different assumptions about what is ethical, what is right. So those are the 4 paradigmatic assumptions that we should keep at the forefront of our mind as we're doing an assumption audit or an assumption critique of a given program as we try to practice evaluative thinking. So where do these all show up? I've already sort of hinted at this. The prescriptive assumptions have to do with where, even the why the program is being offered. The causal assumptions are those links, those arrows between the activities and the outcomes. And the paradigmatic assumptions are the cloud floating around the entire program, but which have a strong influence on what's going on.